Perfect. So, hello, everyone, and hello to you again, Poly Polyglot
Mm-hmm.
TV. Is that your name on YouTube as well?
No, just Polyglot on YouTube. Polyglot TV is just my Twitter handle.
Gotcha. So, today is the subject of our discussion is pretty much in the title and in the description. Has a lot to do with recent events and
Mm-hmm.
specifically about certain discussions that have been happening ever since that event of the shooting in Club Q. So ever since that event, we've seen violent rhetoric from the right increasing and continuing, uh, regardless of the events that occurred. It even seemed to embolden them. And on the other hand, what we've seen also is a push from certain people on the left to call for queer people to arm themselves so as to protect themselves from other similar attacks that have occurred uh, in the club and that have occurred in the past years, but that seem to be happening more and more frequently and that seem to be encouraged more and more frequently. So I am leaning on the idea that people who are targeted for with violent actions
Mm-hmm.
should tend to uh, arm themselves ostentatiously in key strategic at-risk places for the sake of deterrence and intimidation primarily, while personal self-defense should probably relegated to usually less than lethal means. And your discussion was mainly in your side was mainly discussing about guns, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right. So explain your position
Mm-hmm.
briefly.
Sure. Uh, Broadly, my the position that I hold is queer people should not arm themselves as a solution, or rather as a response to all of the terrible legislation being passed by red states, along with the very near genocidal rhetoric that's coming out of the mouths of a lot of politicians, people in power, as well as pundits. Um, the source, or rather the foundation of my position, merely rests on the very strong data that we have in terms of guns being an ineffective tool for self-defense, as well as the mere act of owning a gun also significantly increases the risk of successfully committing suicide. Uh, uh,
Right, and
Obviously, the demographics is going to
that's in
it's
terms
going
of
to matter by demographics. Yeah.
yeah, so that's in terms of personal self-defense and at-home
Hmm.
ownership, I suppose, right? That's
Hmm.
what most data is about.
Hmm.
That's
Yeah.
not the form of ownership that I advocate.
Okay. So, what form of ownership are you advocating for? Because it sounds like when you say like ostentatiously and trying to
Yeah,
do like a show
essentially.
of force, it's similar. It's very reminiscent to a lot of people that I've heard talk about like how the Black Panthers carried weapons around. Is that more or less like what you're talking about?
Actually, my examples are a lot more recent. It's
Mm-hmm.
also about recent queer events that have had
Mm-hmm.
community members show up and surround the premises while armed,
Mm-hmm.
specifically to prevent people from trying to physically break in and commit violence upon people who are engaging in the events. And that's something that we've seen in previous events, even before the latest shooting, where I remember there was a kids drag show
Mm-hmm.
in an ice cream parlor shop. People have tried
Mm-hmm.
to break in. People would try to pry open the doors
Mm-hmm.
and God knows what would have happened if they had managed to.
Mm-hmm.
So now the question becomes: so what we've seen, however, with recent events where there are armed people just simply standing in the way of the door, is
Mm-hmm.
that would be bad faith actors are stopping right in front of the actual armed people and are using them kind of as a way to show how hysterical queer people are. Look at them with their guns. They're trying to threaten us. Yeah, the point is intimidation. Is to intimidate people who would commit harm upon you to not. It's an act of deterrence. So the form of ownership that I would advocate for would be a form of ownership where spaces that are specifically at risk of being targeted have weapons stored in them specifically for when events occur during which they would be targeted. And specifically, so essentially, if you have a gay bar and you have a gun, you have people who are trained and who are hired to protect the premises and who stand there like a bouncer, but trained to ostentatiously display the firearm to open carry and otherwise do the same job as they otherwise would. I don't advocate for people to actually keep guns in their home because in
Okay.
terms of personal defense, it has been shown to be rather ineffective and it has been shown to be very harmful and an extreme risk to most people. If you have a gun in your home, you're more likely to end up harming yourself or one of your loved ones than actually defending yourself.
Yeah.
In terms of home invasions, a less than lethal close range object that is used as a weapon is more effective to defend yourself. You can talk about a baseball bat or a hammer or any such things.
Mm-hmm.
So again, if you're talking about self-defense on a personal level, then that's also what I would advocate for.
Okay.
However, I would also say that even if it's even ostentatiously branding less than lethal weapons, doesn't even need to be guns, in front of those at-risk places, can still end up serving a deterrent effect on would-be attackers. Because the reality is that the point of such attacks is to commit a massive amount of damage upon an easy target. And therefore, any would-be target displaying a willingness for resistance, a willingness and an ability for resistance is going to deter would-be attackers away. And this is not meant to be as a reaction to the rhetoric or to the legislation, but specifically to the fact that attacks upon queer spaces, upon queer people, are increasing in intensity and in frequency.
Okay, so then I don't think we're going to disagree very strongly then. So, because a lot of the discourse that's been happening on Twitter seems to be people, and it's probably not all. I'm pretty sure like a lot of the positions are nuanced, but it seems to me that a lot of people were advocating for like individual trans people to take up arms, which it seems like we both agree is not a good idea. So I think we can like move past that point because I'm not sensing any strong disagreement there. In terms of
groups are made out of individuals, so if you want to have a group of individuals that is that is armed, then you're going to need individuals who are armed to form that group.
Well, sure, but like once again, we're talking about like,
but then it's all about how you engage in that ownership.
Yeah, that's like the point, right? So when people are saying people should go out and get armed, it sounds like they're saying you should just like buy a gun, keep it at home, or just like own it like a typical like gun owner would, like own it privately. It sounds like you're saying you just want the spaces where LGBT people tend to congregate, have those areas armed, like either stock the guns there or have specifically trained security people, posted there as like a show of force in order to deter potential attackers. That's basically your position, right?
Yeah, but I'm also in favor of less than lethal armament in terms of self-defense. Like, if you're scared of a home invasion, it's like keeping a baseball bat around.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Yeah,
because when it comes to less than lethal weaponry, the whole point is that it's less than lethal. So then when you're talking about the risks of committing suicide, well, those aren't really nearly as much of a factor.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. I'm not terribly familiar with the efficacy of like using less than lethal tactics versus like running away or calling for help.
I still believe in the duty to retreat even within one's home, just because it's a general principle where you do what needs to be done to avoid the confrontation, and then when you actually are cornered and flight is no longer an option, then you fight. However, since the since the possibility of being cornered is always there, you should still have a space with a weapon at the
Hmm.
ready for it.
Sure.
So this is what a lot of self-defense advocates, in terms of home invasions, end up saying is, have a space within your home where you can actually just hold out, hide, but have a weapon at hand in case.
Hmm. Yeah. Basically, as a last resort. Yeah. I don't disagree there. But now your position though is having armed people that are specifically trained in the use of firearms would deter shooters. This, I'd be very curious to see what reason you have to believe this, because we seem to have data suggesting that, like, for example, in schools, having SROs, police officers, or like school resource officers that are trained and carry weapons on school grounds really don't seem to have like any impact in terms of deterring school shooters, for
The thing
example.
is that they're on school grounds; they're not necessarily visible. So when you're dealing with a deterrent force, most individuals are going to react to what they can immediately see, and they're going to trying to find a way around it if they can, if they are determined enough to commit a violent act. So to have and exits and entrances, exits and entrances have people visibly posted. The whole point is to kind of create the sense of a wall. So that's very different than to have those officers who essentially patrol the grounds but are not necessarily visible, leave a lot of holes for people to walk into. And this is what we've seen in a lot of schools. It's just the officers are either not in the way, or they don't actually form any form. They don't actually actualize any form of defense for the premises, because their own protocol is to retreat and then call for backup instead of actually defending the premises and the people within them.
Gotcha. Now, in hmm, I'm just curious because I believe in during the I know this is a bit anecdotal, but I believe during the Uvalde shooting, the actual attacker, when he went into the school, had confronted the SRO initially when he went in, and he still returned anyway um, to commit the attack. So, if you're just saying we should have armed folks just guarding every single entrance,
Well, we're talking about
and
community
then
spaces. They most likely only have two,
mhm,
whereas with a school there are a lot more. And whereas there's only
mhm,
like one SRO on duty at a time. This is what happened. This is like so.
yeah,
The case of a school is much different
mhm. In terms of like a total manpower required to actually like defend a
in terms
school.
of logistics. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Uh, okay. In terms of what you're advocating for, like who exactly would be in charge of like doing it? Like who would you prefer to do it? Like would it be like a private security firm, or would it just be like appointed members of the community that would be in charge of
It could be
doing that
it
task?
could be a formed regulated militia. It could also just be the bouncer of the premises if it's if it's a bar, to get training with the paid for by the owner, or it could be also a security firm hired. Although I don't necessarily think that's the best option, considering that
Mhm.
security firms have their first protocols to protect their own personnel first and foremost, rather and so there's going to be the same issues as with an SRO.
Okay. And in terms of the storage of the weapons, um,
It's probably best in the premises within a safe
on the
locked
premises.
container.
Okay. Well, I mean, if that is the case, then I don't think we really disagree at that point. Because my whole position is private storage. seems to have way more bad outcomes than good outcomes, um, for a variety of reasons.
Mm,
But if we're talking about like keeping them like in a commercial space where people really aren't going to have regular use for them unless like during business hours when that protection is going to be needed, um, I yeah, I don't think I strongly I don't think I even disagree with that really,
right. So,
if that's the
because
case.
what I've seen also a lot is
Mm-hmm.
people just using kind of like the slogan "arm queer people,"
Mm-hmm.
and people jumping to a specific form of armament and specific notion of
Mm-hmm.
being armed, which jumps immediately to guns and jumps immediately to personal armament
Yeah.
and personal ownership at within the home.
Yeah.
So I think that those forms of armament and those forms of ownership have shown to be rather uh, harmful to the population at large.
Mhm.
What I do have a big issue with, though, is the arguments that queer people are at an additional risk and therefore should be additionally deterred from uh, owning weapons in comparison to the general population.
Mhm. Okay, so we can definitely get into this question then.
Mhm.
Um, uh,
Like, for example, would you tell
yeah.
women not to would you tell women that they shouldn't own a gun specifically because they're more at risk of attempted suicide?
So my position is nobody should own a gun, like ideally, at least in the form of like private storage, like we already agreed on. Like
Hmm.
if a woman came up to me and said, "Hey, I want to buy a gun, I want to keep it at home for like home invasion defense," I would say like, no, you absolutely shouldn't. I would say the same thing
Yeah,
to a
yeah.
man, but in terms of like moral value, like. I believe like a very good study that I found from a Harvard review found that a woman owning a handgun is 35 times more likely to successfully commit suicide versus a man who is 8 times more likely to commit suicide by owning a handgun. So like in terms of like the utilitarian calculus, I would say like um, if people have to own guns, like women probably shouldn't relative to men, but like uh, broadly speaking, like private ownership
So
of guns in your home,
specifically,
it's not, yeah.
yeah. So specific. That's usually a statistic that's caused by women actually attempting suicide at a higher rate than men. So, and that suicide attempt rate is
Hmm.
caused by various different factors. So
Hmm.
essentially, well, largely due to their societal disenfranchisement in comparison to
Hmm.
men. So essentially, the consequences of their social disenfranchisement should also essentially lead to their different treatment, where we have to treat them as if they're a threat to themselves statistically. Is that what I understand?
If they own a gun, then yes. Like we can obviously look at like, for example, trans people also have like higher suicidality, but also largely because of societal factors like the lack of acceptance and obviously attempts to like strictly regulate or even ban access to like the life-saving treatments that they need. All of these things do feed into higher suicidality, but because of that higher suicidality, I think that's like a stronger moral case against owning a gun, even if we agree that the cause of the higher suicidality is like a totally unjust thing that should be done away with.
Hmm. So they should be treated as a special case specifically because of the circumstances in which they live.
I don't know what you mean by treated differently. Like, I don't think I would
Well, I
pass
mean,
a law saying that like women and trans people can't own guns. I would just say in terms of like arguments, I would like make a very
you
strong
would
moral case
socially
that they shouldn't.
discourage them more than other less at-risk groups.
I would put stronger moral emphasis on them not owning guns because it seems to be the case that um, they have like a higher success rate or a higher suicide rate. And like I don't want more people dying if they don't have to. So that's why I generally just um,
Yeah,
discourage like advocate for the discouragement of like owning guns in the the typical private sense that everyone talks about or everyone thinks about.
that's something that I take issue with. And I
Hmm.
can understand the perspective of wanting to discourage general
Mm-hmm.
like weapon ownership among the entire
Yeah.
population, but to then single out specific groups
Mm-hmm.
because they're at risk rather than to point out what makes them at risk and trying to target those issues.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like for one,
Mm-hmm.
it takes away the argument from being people shouldn't have guns to then
Mm-hmm.
making it these people shouldn't have guns.
Mm-hmm.
And then that ends up creating a narrow argument that
Yeah.
targets the demographic a lot more than the issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I
And
yeah.
secondly, it also ends up creating a whole argument about why shouldn't they own guns, and you end
Mm-hmm.
up mentioning they're at risk, well, why
Mm-hmm.
that they're at risk, and
Mm-hmm.
then there's a lot of discussion about why they're at risk and the issues that
Mm-hmm.
they face,
Sure.
and that's a lot of energy loss as to whether, whereas that
Mm-hmm.
energy could be spent on actually discussing those issues at length
Sure.
and trying to organize some forms of action to
Mm-hmm.
address them.
Yeah. So let's be clear here. If you look at all of the tweets, because I did make a lot of tweets on this subject, I don't think a single one of them says that women shouldn't own guns. The only reason we're talking about trans people is because there seems to be a large unspecific call for queer people to get armed.
Right. Queer
That's
people,
like
not
the
just
whole reason.
trans people. So,
Yeah, yeah.
like,
So like all people of all like in that group, yeah.
right.
Just to be clear. So because people are making that call, that's why I felt the need to like specifically say, hey, trans people or queer people in particular tend to have higher suicide rates, like trans people especially, because of like all of the societal factors that we already agree on 100%. The fact of the matter at the end of the day, and maybe we can disagree on this, is that if every trans person got armed today, like that would lead to far more death than if they none of them got armed at all. So that's the whole like moral motivation for me because
You would see a direct uptick, but then you could also say that with the increasing about violence, you would see an increasing amount of trans death if they aren't armed or if there aren't any measures to defend themselves. So like it kind of seems a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario
Mhm.
where you can't rely on the state to protect you because legislations are being passed to actively hurt you. There's this history of the police disregarding your needs of protection as people and even actively contributing to your harm. There's also and then you yourself are disarmed because you're scared of the possibilities of an accident or of self-harm using a weapon, which
Mhm.
leaves you at risk while there's an
Mhm.
increasing amount of violence going on.
Mhm.
So then, or you can engage in armament
Mhm.
to then
Mhm.
so that you can rely on yourself and on your community
Mhm.
and your fellow community members
Mhm.
while putting yourself at risk from that
Mhm.
weapon.
Mhm.
So it's like you're either putting yourself at risk or you're
Mhm.
putting yourself at risk.
Yeah. So we have to like look at the credence here, or like the probabilities. Like the probabilities that you'll end up in a mass shooting are extremely low. Like if
I would
you
say they vary wildly depending on the region in which you live currently and what kind of
yeah.
activities you engage in. And then you also have to discuss as to whether or not people should stop engaging in those activities, which I say they shouldn't. Because the reality is, whether they do or not, they might be protecting themselves in the moment, but they are ultimately not allowing themselves to live at all. So you're just choosing not to live to survive.
I I don't accept that. So to finish what I was saying, the chances of you getting into a mass shooting, like obviously it's going to vary state to state, but also like the level of suicidality is also going to vary state by state if you own a gun privately. We would have to like compare the credence of what's the risk that you'll commit suicide with a weapon given the state that you live in, and what is the chance that you're going to like end up in a mass shooting given the state that you live in. I think
I think it goes
across the board
further
the
than just
risk for
state.
suicide is
I
going to be
think it's
much
actually.
higher.
I think it's more than just state. I think it's all. I think it could be much more localized
Even
because there are
then,
specific communities within specific states that are like at much higher risk, right? We don't
Hmm.
talk about sundown states. We talk about sundown towns.
Sure. So like even then, like I would be very hard. I think you would be very hard pressed to demonstrate that the you would have a higher risk of getting into a mass shooting than having like a higher risk of committing suicide. I think it would be like extremely hard to find
Specific
that.
spaces are at a higher risk, definitely, and the people within them are at a higher
Higher,
risk, definitely.
higher than suicide.
Well,
That's
that's
what
the
we have to
thing. That's the
compare.
thing. We don't necessarily have the numbers on that, and we would have to compare. We don't have the data. We don't have all of the relevant data. Now, when it comes
Hmm.
to actual personal self-defense, your risk of actually being personally assaulted, those can vary wildly a lot more depending on your local region, specifically your town or even your neighborhood within a town.
Hmm.
But again, this is why I say that for personal self-defense, it's better to have a less than lethal close quarters apparatus, specifically because most personal cases of violence are close quarters, and so having a weapon that is not designed for that is probably going to leave you ill-equipped.
Hmm.
So
Sure, but once
it's
again, like we would still.
it's a whole question. So then there's the whole question of you protect yourself and put yourself at risk from that weapon, or you don't protect yourself and put yourself at risk from a personal attack,
Hmm.
depending on your local region,
Hmm.
or of a mass attack depending on your community space that you attend.
Hmm.
And that's why I think that the community space specifically should be protected. Whereas when people are looking for personal protection, they should look for less than lethal close
Yeah.
quarters armament that is more adapted to the kinds of situations they're likely to face.
Mhm. Yeah, I don't think we disagree on that policy. So I'm not sure why we're getting back to that.
But
The original line of argument we were on was, is there like a good moral case for some demographics? Like, is there a greater moral onus for certain demographics to not own guns? And given the higher risks among certain demographics and certain communities, I think that is absolutely the case. We can quibble about like whether it's optically good or not, but like if we're talking about the moral fact of the matter, I
it's
think,
not really
yeah, I
about
think it's
it,
absolutely the
it's
case.
less about optics and more about what it leads the messaging to functionally do. So
Hmm.
optics is more about how people will feel about a messaging. Me, it's
Hmm.
about what the messaging serves as what ideas it pushes. So when you have a whole messaging about people shouldn't have guns, then that's addressing guns as the issue.
Hmm.
When you're talking
Hmm.
about these people shouldn't have guns, you're singling them out, and then the focus is not going to be on the guns; it's going to be on the people
Hmm.
and why they're different and why
Hmm.
they shouldn't have them. So
Hmm.
that's the difference, is that the messaging itself is going to serve a completely different purpose and is going to lead
Sure.
to an entirely different discussion.
Sure, but I don't think that discussion is necessarily bad. Like, I could say, and I actually do say, that white men should not own guns. Why? Because if you look at, particularly in the Midwest, older white men tend to have a very elevated suicide rate compared to the average, and that could be that's likely due to a lot of like economic despair, the Rust Belt, jobs leaving, and just like not having really like anything to look forward to in life. That is a real problem, and I think like having discussion about that is like, I think that's a good thing. If I were to do the same, like which I did on Twitter, and talk about the higher risks of suicide among trans people and queer people more broadly, I don't see like what the issue with that is in particular, because I think it's good to say, hey, this group really shouldn't own guns. Why is that? Well, here are all of the reasons that trans people are facing oppression in society, and that oppression leads them into like situations that are more likely to lead to a successful suicide if they own a gun privately. Similar to
I
like
can understand
white
your
old men.
perspective. I can
Yeah.
understand that perspective. I just think that discussion never
Hmm.
really, like, when you make that argument for white old men,
Hmm.
we never see those arguments about white old men. and so that creates a
Mhm.
messaging that
Mhm.
specifically targets one specific people and creates
Mhm.
and creates an idea about one specific people that plays into a hugely harmful trope that is used to then further disenfranchise that
Yeah.
one specific people.
Yeah. But like once again, like the only reason I'm not talking about that is because I'm not seeing people on Twitter talking about the need for white old men to start owning guns and like start arming up.
That's
If
because
that
they
were the
already
case, I'd probably be talking about
they
that.
that's because they largely are the ones who are already armed up.
Right. And they shouldn't be because of the very high suicidality that they already demonstrate.
Yeah, but
Given all
it's
of the social issues that they are suffering.
yeah, but on one hand, most people on Twitter don't tend to really discuss white old men's issues in terms
Right.
of,
Right.
and also they tend to really try and deter specific people from getting guns rather than
Hmm.
encourage them from getting rid of them.
Hmm.
And it seems like they're really they're playing defense on it.
Hmm.
They're not trying to encourage people from letting go of their guns. They're just trying to deter people from getting more of their guns. But
Yeah, I agree that that's like what that demographic wants. But once again, like if nobody had said like queer people arm up, then like this debate and likely all of the Twitter interactions and debates on the subject would not be happening, right? So
yeah, I mean, my big take was
yeah,
just like armed queer people doesn't have to mean guns, but Americans are too Smith and Wesson pilled to realize
yeah,
that.
yeah. I believe you're Quebecois, so like when we hear like arm up, like we in America we constantly go to guns as our favorite tool, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, we don't we tend to just riot with the good old tools rather than use our
Yeah,
guns.
yeah.
Yeah, especially when
Like,
there's a hockey yeah, especially when there's a hockey game, you know.
hmm,
Why shoot a gun when you can flip a cop car?
yeah. Or like back in France when they did the Gilets jaunes protests, just like knock shit out, fight with your hands. That's the kind of direct action that I'm all about.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um, yeah.
so really I think that really we shouldn't be talking about these people
Hmm.
should not arm themselves. I think we should rather try and have a discussion about how to arm yourself responsibly. Instead of deterring people from arming themselves, we should actually talk about how to engage in responsible
Hmm.
arms ownership, talking about how to not keep one at your home because that's not where it's meant to be. That's not
Hmm.
where it'll be most useful. That's
Hmm.
not where, and talking about specifically what other methods you should use to protect yourself within the home and
Hmm.
what methods you should use to protect yourself as a group rather than how
Hmm.
to protect yourself as an individual.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so these whole discussions of like X group shouldn't arm themselves, Y group shouldn't arm themselves, nobody should arm themselves. I think they end up being serving really a reductive purpose, where it's just a yes and no butting heads against each other.
Yeah.
Both of whom have valid reasons that come from different ethical points, from different ethical perspectives and moral
Hmm.
perspectives. But that's the whole problem with debating and discussing from different ethical and moral perspectives is it's really hard to reach one another. So I think
Yeah.
that it serves a better function if we just accept the fact that there is a need for protection.
Hmm.
We need to discuss how to most responsibly engage in it.
Hmm. Yeah. That's ultimately the debate at the end of the day, and I think that's what we should be focusing our energies on. However, just to get back to like the whole issue, because I don't think we've like fully settled on it or uh, reached a conclusion there. It the whole purpose of the whole purpose of like the response to arming trans people or arming queer people, ultimately it has to do with like what is going to save the most amount of lives. If everybody or like the vast majority of people who are talking about arming queer people are saying, hey, we need to have like armed security, we need to have guns stored in a safe place that will not lead to higher suicidality, and we need to ensure that they're used by, the best well-trained people.
They don't need to be the best well-trained people. They just
Or
need to be somewhat adequately well-trained.
reasonably trained.
Like I
Yeah.
would like I received basic rifle training while I was in the Air
Hmm.
Cadets. I would probably be fine because I know how to just clean and reload and shoot a gun safely, or hold a weapon safely.
Hmm.
Have trigger training, trigger
Hmm.
safety training. That's like all of that stuff is actually pretty basic, but
Hmm.
we just need to make sure that those basics are taught.
Yeah. Yeah. If that is what people are advocating for, then I don't disagree. If people, on the other hand, are just advocating for random people to save up their money and buy a gun and own it privately, then, like, obviously I'm going to say, yeah, that is a very bad idea. And the reason it's bad is because it leads to much higher suicidality or higher successful suicides.
That's another point that I keep
Yeah.
on talking about. Is just like, man, you want to protect yourself as an individual. Buying a hammer is going to be a whole lot cheaper for you.
Mhm.
It's going to be a whole lot more financially accessible, because people talk about how, oh yeah, guns are cheap.
Mhm.
They're not nearly as cheap as that. They're not nearly as cheap as a hammer
Right.
or a baseball bat, or hell, just even like any other like uh object that could be used to hit or bash somebody.
Right.
So, like a gun is at least like in the three digits. When most
Yeah.
people who are within those demographic groups, I mean, queer people are financially disenfranchised by and large, so
Exactly.
it's even more difficult for them to reach those three figures to just be able to spend on a whim.
Yeah.
Like, especially if they're young, and if they're young, then they're probably even more at risk, and they're more likely to and they're more at risk of being homeless, which means that
Yeah.
you even have, which means that if you're in that kind of situation,
Mhm.
it's even more difficult to engage in that responsible
Yeah.
ownership, and it's even
Yeah.
more difficult to have access to that kind of weaponry. So it's best to just
Sure.
get what you have the easiest access to and what has the least chances of hurting yourself, and that is the most
Mhm.
adequate to responding to the needs you have.
Sure. Sure. But I do want to stress on this point. When people say arm queer people, uh, it, it sounds like they're advocating for like mass private ownership of guns, like what you're advocating for.
Yeah, of
It
course
doesn't
that's
even.
what it sounds like, because it's an
Yeah.
extremely vague statement, but
Yeah.
it's also
Yeah.
like it's a
Yeah.
vague statement because it's supposed to englobe
Hmm.
many different things
Hmm.
that essentially people are saying.
Hmm.
Like when people say arm queer people, well, it doesn't need to be a firearm, it just needs to be an arm. If it doesn't
Sure.
need to be and it doesn't necessarily need to be only personal, it can be in other
Hmm.
forms as well. It's
Hmm.
just saying, don't don't leave yourself
Hmm.
vulnerable to the violence that you're likely to be targeted with in
Hmm.
these times, and especially if you're in
Hmm.
if you're in a local region where you're at
Hmm.
added risk.
Yeah. So, like, once again, I'm not disagreeing with your prescriptions, but it's a little strange to me because it sounds like what you're advocating for doesn't even necessarily entail queer people getting armed, since, like, obviously you could have cis allies using the guns, or having like outside companies managing it, like, hypothetically. So like,
Hypothetically,
once
sure.
again,
I mean,
yeah.
of course I want cis allies to protect queer people. Why
Yeah.
the hell would I not?
Yeah.
But
Like
I
it,
would
yeah.
and like hiring a security company, I suppose, would
Yeah.
be a last resort, and even
Yeah.
then you would need to have the means to do so.
Yeah. But my problem is when people say arm queer people, uh it's not intuitive that, like, what they're arguing for is like having LGBT spaces protected by like well trained or reasonably trained people with guns being stocked or managed in a shared space, like in a commercial space, not in a private setting. So if that's what you're advocating for, I
Well,
don't
is
think we'll,
I
we'll find
honestly, I just think
disagreement.
it's because it's a vague statement, and people
Yeah.
jump onto the most common form of ownership that they are
Right.
aware of. But
Right.
that's just because you have a preconception of what arming is.
Hmm.
So, and most people do, so they end
Yeah.
up jumping onto what that
Yeah.
preconception is.
Right.
So,
So wouldn't you say that's like irresponsible then, of like the advocates who are trying to like keep queer people safe?
I think they should go into more detail, but if you're just trying to
Uh,
get people's attention so as to then give the details, go for it.
uh sure. Uh, my issue is that a lot of the people that I debated on Twitter about this were not very clear, and I think you're the first person that I've like actually spoken to about this subject that
Can you
has
name one of those? Can you name some
this.
of those people?
Oh God, I blocked a lot of them. Uh, oh gosh.
Because I know that like A Pillow was one of them who talked about it a lot, and I think it was
Wait a minute. I think I can find at least one of them. I think Pog Crab was making the case for private ownership as well as
not familiar with them.
yeah, I'm familiar with them. I've known them for quite a bit. And then I think there was like a very big Twitter account called Jenny. I don't know. I don't know. I have to like
Somewhat
find
familiar.
her Twitter
Honestly,
handle.
Twitter to me is like a blur.
Yeah.
I barely register. Like
Yeah.
unless we actually spend a lot of time interacting, I barely register you as an individual person.
hmm No, I also consider it a blur, but those are like two people off the top of my head that I can think of that didn't really have
Because
like extremely well thought out
yeah,
prescriptions for arming and protecting queer people. But like
because
what you have proposed, like I don't think I have any issue with that.
yeah, because the funny thing is I've talked privately
hmm
with a lot of the people who I've seen get into arguments because they
hmm
said armed queer people, and whenever I the thing is I would never confront them, I would never disagree with them, I would just list my own prescriptions, and they would just flat
hmm
out agree with me,
hmm
which is
Well, yeah,
funny.
because like your prescriptions, like I think they're perfectly fine. Like my concern is I want to make sure that like people don't feel encouraged or empowered to engage in private ownership because I think that's like where the real danger, or like where the greater danger lies for a lot of queer communities like across the country,
Hmm.
even in like dangerous places like Florida and Texas, for example.
Yeah. Well, I think that what we're seeing, which is really constructive, is we're seeing a visible encouragement of those kinds of group forms of armament that are designed to protect community spaces.
hmm
That's what we've seen, a large encouragement of it, because we're seeing like a positive example to follow that is visual, it's there, and people are actually engaging with it, at least as an idea,
hmm
which is which when people have a visual example to follow, they tend to engage in it a lot more than when they're just told to do something. And I think that the
hmm
visual example that they're being given is a lot more productive.
Yeah, I got you.
Right.
All
So,
right. Were
yeah,
there
I think that
any other lines of questioning or argumentation you wanted to get into?
no, not really. I think that
hmm
we've circled the subject quite a bit. It's just
Yeah.
I think that we really need to kind of step
hmm
aside from we need to kind of step away from the gun versus no gun discussion and instead try
hmm
and go, oh, you want to arm queer people, okay, cool, this is how I think we should do it. And
hmm
when you do it without the confrontation and you instead push with your own prescriptions, that's when I've seen most people starting to agree with the more reasonable take that I have
hmm
adopted.
Yeah.
The lack of confrontation makes people much more open to your view of how to go about it.
hmm
Whereas when you actually go and debate and go, no, this is no, you shouldn't do that, and then it's like,
hmm
yes, you should, and you just start butting heads.
hmm
But that's just basic human communication failing on Twitter and social media as a general. Yeah, in
hmm
general, it
Sure.
just doesn't work.
Gotcha. One last question, because I'm not sure I got like a super clear answer on it. As a hypothetical, if you had like the Thanos like glove, you could like make reality whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
If you had to arm a particular demographic, let's say you had to choose between men and women, and you know that women tend to have a higher suicide rate, you have to give one of these demographics guns. Do you think it's unreasonable to give guns to the least, to the demographic that has like the lower suicidality on
What
average? Do you think that's like
I have the
unreasonable?
Thanos gauntlet. I can just like reshape reality.
Yeah, so you can give guns to one of the
I
demographics,
would
but you
take
have
away
to
the
give them guns.
suicidality factors. You just gave me control over reality. You expect
I
me
know.
not to use
I'm
it?
sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, I got you. But the point I'm trying to get at is, do you think it's unreasonable if you had to give someone a gun? Like, let's just say two people. Between two people, you have to give them one gun. Is it unreasonable to give it to the person who has like lower suicidality if
Who's
you
the
had to
person
give
who's
them a
more
gun?
likely to also use it on others?
Uh,
We
probably
both know that
probably the one with
statistic.
lower suicide. Yeah, we do. But
Yeah.
once again, I don't know if
That's
like
like that's
that
the whole issue. It's
outweighs
just
it.
like
Yeah.
I increase a person's chances of
Yeah.
harming themselves, or I increase this
Hmm.
person's chances of harming others. At like either group I choose, I end up hurting someone.
Yeah, but I.
So it's another
But do
then
you
if you
think?
then if you do then if you don't.
But do you really think the probability is equal,
The
or like?
probability, well,
Yeah.
if you account for let's say white man's chances of engaging in uh, gun violence against others, and
Hmm.
white men's chances of engaging in gun violence against themselves, I suppose, and firearm suicide, uh,
Hmm.
or even firearm accidents where they harm themselves. In comparison to women's chances of harming others and themselves, I think we would need to have more data, but I think that women's tendency, by and large, women's tendency is to turn violent urges inward rather than outward, statistically speaking.
Hmm.
And so it kind of just evens out. Am I instinctively? That's what I'm thinking.
That's like your intuition, but like we would probably
Well,
need more data to be
we don't have
conclusive.
the data sets to really compare apples to apples. So I'm thinking one group is more likely to commit harm upon others. One group is more likely to commit harm upon itself.
Hmm.
So it's just like whereas I'm thinking, okay, well, regardless of whether the harm is committed upon others or upon the self, what amount of harm is actually committed? What are the likes? What is the likelihood of the harm being committed at all, regardless of the target? Then that's when I'm thinking that it would probably start to even out.
Sure. So
But
if we compare the risk of like committing harm to others versus yourself, I mean, if we were to say that like women had the same suicide rate or like the same suicide ideation rate as like trans people at like I think 40 or 41%, like I think at that rate, if they don't commit harm as much harm to others as themselves, like I think that very high rate would probably be a good justification to say if we have to give someone a gun at all, it probably shouldn't be the person or the persons who have this extremely high tendency
yeah, but then
for
again,
suicide.
that's the point where I'm thinking, yeah, we should have like mental health checks, whereas we
Hmm.
actually evaluate the individuals. Because now we're talking about demographic groups. There's individuals within those demographic groups, and there's ways of actually engaging in like responsible arms distribution, not just ownership. Right?
Hmm.
There are regulations we can put in place, and and essentially like when somebody has a history of suicidal ideation, you just like ask them to get an evaluation before they can get their weapon. As long as that evaluation is is easily accessible, then I don't see an issue in that. Um, and essentially just going, essentially assuring that you're not currently a risk to yourself.
But but I
And
don't think that's
also
I
I
don't
would and
yeah.
also I would definitely, when it comes to at home ownership, I would definitely put in a license requirement, and I would make that license actually like require a course in terms of like
Hmm.
in terms of safety. Um,
Hmm.
because then the ability to own arms and the ability to own them, to own
Hmm.
them within your home, two entirely different
Hmm.
things. You can talk about the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. There's
Hmm.
nothing in there about being able to get that, to hide them under your pillow, or to hide
Hmm.
them in your freaking bed frame.
Right. About the mental health checks, I have to disagree because I'm not sure if that's sufficient in the sense that when
It might
people
not be
commit
sufficient.
suicide,
It might not be
yeah,
sufficient on its own. I think it
hmm
would be a. I think it would help though.
it
Like
would
that was just
help.
one example. That was just one
Yeah,
example of measures that we could put in place.
yeah, no, I agree. I would help, but the thing that I'm getting at is when people commit suicide, it tends to be in like high panic situations. So like maybe a parent dies, or like you lose like a very nice job, like all of a sudden,
Yeah, I
and
know.
in a sense of panic, you commit suicide. And my point is, trans people, given their very precarious stance in society, they're probably more likely to experience those moments of panic than like other demographics. Would you not agree?
I think that statistically, yes, they're more likely to uh, go through those moments of panic. I
Hmm.
also think that having the solid community networks and the help
Hmm.
accessible to be able to deal with those situations of panic, it would help push them away from those options, especially if we don't have ownership within the home, if we have other forms of
Yeah,
ownership,
yeah.
where you
And what?
actually have some level of distance, like just in terms of time between you and the
Hmm.
gun,
Yeah.
where you just like, oh, I'm going to hurt myself. I'm gonna drive to the range where I
Hmm.
store my gun, and then I'm gonna check it out, and
Yeah.
just that amount of time, like let's say 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Most likely, what you're gonna do is you're gonna go into your car and make yourself crash. If you're suicidal to that point where you just are looking for the most immediate way of killing yourself, you're probably gonna use your car instead.
If you don't have a gun available.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're probably gonna
Maybe.
like you're on your way to your gun because you want to kill yourself, but you're already in
Hmm.
your car, which is a more than efficacious way of killing yourself.
Hmm.
Depending on how intent on doing so you are,
Hmm.
probably gonna end up using that.
I'm not sure. I think suffocation is like the second, like most popular method
I
of
was more talking
using
about
suicide. But like, yeah, I got you.
suffocation. Yeah, I mean, there's dioxide. There's a carbon dioxide suffocate. There's a suffocation through
Yeah.
carbon dioxide as well. But
Yeah. No, I
that's
got you.
yeah, that's a whole
Yeah.
other issue. So yeah, I think
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
in a high stress situation, obviously the gun makes people more likely to have access to an easy way of committing the deed.
Hmm.
But so I think that the best way is to engage in a form of ownership where there's a level of distance between yourself and the
Right.
means of committing that act.
Right.
And then that will just serve as a means of protecting people large,
Yeah.
like a huge amount.
No, I got you. Like putting more distance between like a person and their gun, like in moments it's not necessary. Like, yeah, I definitely agree. With like the good outcomes of that. Once again, like the whole,
And
I guess,
there's
yeah.
like the other situation where if also you store your gun within a specific outside of your home space,
Hmm.
there is also the possibility that we could regulate the amount of ammo you check out at any given time alongside with your gun, and then
Hmm.
that would limit people's ability to commit harm
Hmm.
upon others. And when we're talking about mass violence,
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think we disagree on that point. I guess like to put a pin on the whole discussion, the whole response in terms of queer people should not arm themselves because of the higher suicidality or the higher risk factors, on a demographic basis. The whole assumption behind that argument is like private ownership or like private storage. If we're going to say no, what we mean by armed queer people is like having some sort of communal or commercial storage, then yeah,
I
I
mean,
wouldn't disagree on that point. If we're talking about like, we have to like understand like the assumptions of like the people who are like debating and discussing this question online. If we're talking about private storage, I think there's like a very strong, reasonable case for certain demographics to avoid private ownership of guns versus
right.
others. I think you can make a very
So
strong moral case for that
now
on
I think
consequentialist lines.
now I think you need to look at who are making those arguments and what kind of
Mhm.
arguments around the community building, the community engagement they want to create, largely is, and then you can get a general idea of what they actually are prescribing.
Mhm.
Again, that's not in their messaging, so they're probably not communicating it well in that
Gotcha.
moment. but if you get to know their messaging, if you get to know their positions, then
Yeah,
you can get a better idea. But again, it's to avoid those kinds of useless arguments, it's best to just
sure.
ask for clarification or to just advance with your own prescriptions of going, oh yeah, like this and
Hmm.
this and this and this. And
Yeah.
then if they contradict you by specifically saying, no, I want specifically private ownership within the homes,
Hmm.
well, it's not exactly the most then it's where the debate can actually take place.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I just wanted to like clarify with you in terms of private ownership of guns that there's like a strong, reasonable, like and moral consequentialist case that you can make that yeah, if guns have to be in the hands of somebody, you would want them to be in the hands of people who have lower suicidality and like lower chances to harm people, like on a total level, right?
Well, I'm gonna think that if we account for like less chances of harming yourself, less chances of harming others, then that
Mhm.
leaves almost no one.
Almost, yeah. But on a relative basis, I don't think it's like equal, right?
Yeah.
Uh, I don't know who the demographic is, but I'm sure like if we crunched enough data, like there would be like a demographic that probably would be the best. But even then,
But
they
even then, I
still
don't think
shouldn't
that we
have
should.
guns.
Even then, I don't
Right.
think that we should make those kinds of decisions based on demographic groups, because that ends
Well,
up leading to forms of discrimination where one group is armed, and when
mhm.
one group is armed far more, specifically because it's deemed to be proportionally more responsible.
Well, the issue isn't the demographic per se, like intrinsic characteristics, but rather like the
Because
actual
that's the thing.
risk
That's the
that's
thing.
present in the demographic.
That's the thing. Is your position doesn't even account for like intrinsic characteristics. It's just saying, well, you're not dealing with all of these factors that make you a risk factor. So since you're not right now a risk factor, we're not going to treat you as one. But these other groups, they're dealing with these factors that make them a risk factors, and we don't exactly know how to deal with those risk factors, so we're just going to treat them as a risk factors without actually bettering their conditions, which means that we're going to preserve them as a risk factor for the foreseeable, if not extremely long-term future, and then that's going to essentially create a caste system when one group is not dealing with the forms of social disenfranchisement that makes them into a risk factor, so they get to be armed, but that other group doesn't. And it's all because we're not dealing with the underlying causes of the risk factors at play.
Well, you can still make a moral case that we ought deal with the risk factors and say, given the significant negative impacts of legislation and the violent rhetoric coming from pundits, because of that, private ownership for trans people isn't something that we ought to encourage. Like, I think you can make a very strong moral case for that. Because, like, we don't want more trans people dying, especially at their own hands, when we can easily prevent that by not encouraging them to buy guns for themselves and rather advocate for, like, a better form of ownership, like we discussed.
Yeah, honestly, I think obviously, I think that the form of ownership that we've discussed is the one that should be advocated for rather
Hmm.
than
Yeah.
personal at home ownership. We've
Yeah.
both agreed on that multiple times
Yeah.
by now, but I
Yeah.
think that the whole notion that one group specifically should be discouraged and therefore will lead to an uneven amount of armament, specifically just based upon demographic group, because one group is dealing with risk factors that others aren't. And
Hmm.
since we're all just talking about social encouragement and discouragement,
Hmm.
that also means that we are not really dealing with the underlying factors that have
Hmm.
to do with vastly larger systems that we don't have necessarily any control over, even
Hmm.
socially. Uh, as large groups of people, we still don't have that amount of power over those systems. So then
Hmm.
you still end up with what I've described, with essentially a cast of people with armament and
Hmm.
another without,
Well, but you already
specifically based on the demographic groups and the risk factors that those groups face.
sure, but like you already agree with this in the sense that um both like the queer demographic and like the non-queer demographic, like none of these people should own guns privately. But I think like you could say that, hey, this graph especially shouldn't because there's like more negative utility, more negative outcomes
I think
associated
some
with a
people.
particular group.
I
Yeah.
think some people should. If you're like a, let's say, a subsistence hunter, then obviously you need to have a gun within the home. But
Hmm.
obviously, if you're also a hunter who engages with that tool on a daily basis, you're a lot more likely to engage with it in a more responsible way because you're far more familiarized and you tend to fetishize it a lot less. Uh, but yeah, that's the
Hmm.
whole notion. So I think that some groups should probably have a gun within the home if that gun serves a specific function that makes sense
Hmm.
within the home.
Hmm. Yeah, but like most people in the West, like are not hunters. So on a macro level, like probably
I can
99.99% of people are not
I
really
can
gonna
drive a
use
couple. I
it.
can drive a couple hours to Labrador and be in a subsistence hunting scenario.
I mean, you could be, but I mean, like, is that like the majority of people who live in Labrador?
No, it's a very few amount of people, but
Yeah.
still significant if you account for a lot. If you account for the entirety of the Labrador population, it's a
Hmm.
significant amount of people.
But on a macro level, like it's not right. Like we went
No, of
from
course not.
yeah,
But it's a significant amount of people that you need to take them into account.
sure. Like once again, like if owning a gun like provides more utility than this utility, then you should own a gun. Like if you need a gun to like survive in the wild and to get food, then like yeah, you should own one. But I don't think most people who live in America or Canada or any Western country are really in the position where a gun is going to give them more utility than disutility.
Yeah, there's the whole argument of like, what if you're in Alaska? You need to eat one. There's polar bears. You can scare off a polar bear. Just ask any Canadian. We can scare off bears like it's nothing.
I bet.
Just throw a beaver at them.
Yeah.
Anyways, so yeah,
Okay.
I think that we've gone around the issue pretty well enough. So
Yeah, I think so.
do arm queer people, but
Hmm.
in the specific responsible way, and we should engage in uh, that form of advocacy, which I think
Yeah.
that which I think that some people have been engaging in that form of advocacy for a while now,
Hmm.
but they tend to just always get distracted by other people who are hard set onto the current common form of ownership
Hmm.
and who get extremely defensive about their own position
Hmm.
whenever it's brought up, even though the form of ownership that's being discussed is not the one that they're against. They will still keep on arguing.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important to actually listen to the form of ownership that is being advocated, not ownership itself.
Yeah. No, I would probably agree with that. Yeah.
All right. So
Okay.
you can plug your channel again and your socials for the
Sh-
chat.
Sure. Uh, let's see. You can find me on Twitter at Polyglot TV. I stream primarily on YouTube. Used to do that on Twitch, but mostly YouTube. You can find me on YouTube at Polyglot, PAULYGLOT. Uh, and I've had a very, very riveting discussion with Jer. I really appreciate you having me on. Learned quite a bit.
Right. Great. And yeah, obviously people who watch channels know me. I am
Hmm.
Jer. You can find me on Twitter.
Hmm.
You can find me on here. You can probably
Hmm.
also find me in the Nordic Model Discord every now and then. I'm mostly a lurker, but I'm one of the moderators, so I'm just here to make sure people behave.
Hmm.
And you can also find me now on Mastodon, punished underscore J3R at home.social.
Hmm.
All right.
Base.
All right. Well, thanks
All
you.
right.
Thank you again for coming. Now I need to let my cat out of my bedroom. She's
All
getting
right.
unnerved.
Okay.
All
Yeah.
right.
Go handle that. All right.
All right.
Have a good night. Thank you very much. Bye
You
bye.
too. Have a nice one.